The universe, as it turned out, had a rather twisted sense of humor. One might say it was cosmic irony at its finest. A species that had spent barely a blink of the galactic timeline fumbling around with rocket science was now the cause of the most significant diplomatic incident since the Great Rigilian Custard Dispute of 2289. The Galactic Confederation of Allied Species prided itself on being the pinnacle of evolved civilization. Their governing chambers gleamed with self-importance and unnecessarily shiny surfaces, while representatives from 812 species congratulated themselves daily on how spectacularly diplomatic they all were. The fact that they'd needed 17 different translation matrices just to agree on the spelling of Confederation was conveniently omitted from their brochures. And then there were the humans. Absolutely preposterous, High Councillor Albert huffed, his respiratory sacs inflating to 3 times their normal size. This was how the Gandorian species expressed extreme displeasure, though to human eyes it looked remarkably like a frog trying to swallow a beach ball. We cannot allow this security breach to continue. The human was thoroughly scanned before entry, countered Ambassador Takrill of the Vantosian Collective, her crystalline appendages clicking in what passed for annoyance among her kind. No weapons, no unauthorized technology. It's not what they bring that concerns me. Zalbert deflated slightly, sending a small puff of rose-scented air toward the ceiling. It's what they are. Across the vast chamber, 497 representatives nodded in solemn agreement, while 215 looked confused, and the remaining 100 were too busy updating their social media feed to notice. The security breach in question was currently sitting in an anteroom, calmly reviewing notes on a datapad, as if being the first human invited to the Confederation's central embassy was no more remarkable than waiting for a dental appointment. Ambassador Eliana Frost, or the human problem as she'd been dubbed in internal memos, represented the newest and most controversial addition to the galactic community. Humans had achieved faster-than-light travel only 73 years ago, stumbling into the cosmic playground like toddlers who'd somehow managed to build a working nuclear reactor out of blocks and sticky tape. The Confederation had watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as these newcomers bounced from planet to planet, making friends and enemies with equal enthusiasm and seemingly oblivious to the complex political landscape they were trampling across. What made humans particularly troublesome wasn't their technology, laughably primitive, their military prowess, concerning but manageable, or even their bizarre biological functions. The concept of sneezing had caused a 3-day panic in the Confederation Xenobiology Department. No, what made humans the galaxy's collective headache was their inexplicable ability to survive and thrive in circumstances that should have, by all reasonable metrics, resulted in their immediate extinction. They're classified as a Class D Deathworld species for a reason, Zilbert continued, his voice dropping to a concerned whisper. Their homeworld is a radioactive nightmare, with extreme temperature variations, constant natural disasters, and an atmosphere that would dissolve the exoskeleton of half the species in this room. And yet, Takrill countered, they consider this camping and do it for recreation. A collective shudder rippled through the chamber. While the Confederation debated, Ambassador Frost remained blissfully unaware of the chaos she was causing. Her credentials were impeccable: PhD in xenolinguistics from Oxford, 3 years on Mars colony as diplomatic liaison, and a pioneering thesis on non-verbal communication among silicon life forms that had earned her both academic acclaim and a restraining order from a particularly sensitive crystal entity on Europa. What the Confederation records failed to mention was her childhood in rural Alaska, where she'd learned to track wolves before she could multiply fractions, or her gap year spent living with indigenous tribes in the Amazon, cataloging venomous insects for fun. They also omitted her rather unusual hobby of free-climbing active volcanoes, which she insisted helped her think clearly about complex problems. In short, they had selected possibly the most qualified and simultaneously most dangerous human for this historic meeting. The door to the anteroom slid open with a pneumatic hiss, startling Eliana out of her review of Ventosian cultural taboos. Apparently, complimenting their crystalline structure was the equivalent of commenting on the size of human reproductive organs. Useful information. Ambassador Frost, a tall, willowy being with skin like polished copper, announced, "The Council will see you now." Eliana tucked her datapad into her regulation diplomatic satchel and stood, smoothing the front of her charcoal grey suit. Earth United Diplomatic Corps had insisted on non-threatening attire, which apparently meant dressing like an accountant who moonlighted as a funeral director. "Thank you, Secretary Zavath," she replied with a practiced smile that carefully concealed her canine teeth. Another recommendation from the cultural briefing team. The Grand Chamber of the Confederation was designed to intimidate. Soaring ceilings disappeared into a simulated nebula, while the circular floor descended in concentric rings, placing the speaking platform at the literal bottom of a pit, surrounded by hundreds of judging aliens. The acoustics were deliberately engineered to make a speaker's voice sound small and insignificant. Eliana, who had once negotiated peace between warring tribes while dangling from a cliff during a thunderstorm, was not intimidated. "Representatives of the Galactic Confederation," she began, her voice clear and carrying, despite the acoustic suppression. "I bring greetings from Earth and all human colonies. We are honored to be considered for observer status in your esteemed body." High Counselor Zilbert's respiratory sacs fluttered nervously. The human wasn't following the expected protocol of stammering apologies for existing. Even worse, several representatives were actually paying attention, rather than scrolling through their message feeds. Ambassador Frost, he intoned with as much gravitas as a being who resembled a sentient balloon could muster. "The Confederation has serious concerns about human inclusion that must be addressed before we proceed." "I welcome your concerns, High Counselor," Eliana replied, her smile unwavering. "Open dialogue is the foundation of lasting diplomacy." "Very well." Zybert inflated slightly for emphasis. "Humanity's classification as a Class D Death World species raises significant security considerations. Your biology includes features evolved specifically for predation. Your psychology demonstrates alarming tendencies toward risk-taking and aggression, and your history contains violence of a nature that many of our members find disturbing." Eliana nodded thoughtfully, as if she'd just been told her shirt was mildly unfashionable, rather than being informed her entire species was considered too dangerous to sit at the adults' table. "These are valid observations, High Counselor. Humans have indeed evolved in a challenging environment that required certain adaptations for survival. However, these same traits have also driven our rapid advancement, our resilience in crisis situations, and our eagerness to form cooperative relationships with new species." A murmur rippled through the chamber. This wasn't going according to plan at all. The human was supposed to be defensive, not reasonable. At the far end of the chamber, a massive door slid open, revealing the late arrival to the proceedings. A collective gasp echoed through the room, followed by a silence so profound it seemed to have physical weight. The Vraxian delegate had arrived. Even among a gathering of the galaxy's most exotic life forms, the Vraxian stood apart. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, with a body that seemed to be composed primarily of muscle, bone, and malice, the Vraxian moved with the fluid grace of an apex predator. Its exoskeleton gleamed like polished obsidian, interrupted only by bioluminescent patterns that pulsed hypnotically along its flanks. Multiple limbs, the exact number was difficult to determine as they seemed to shift and reconfigure with each movement, ended in appendages that somehow managed to appear both elegant and lethal simultaneously. "The Council recognizes Ambassador Kivex of the Vraxian Dominion," announced Secretary Zavath, his copper skin notably paler than before. The Vraxian did not acknowledge the introduction. Instead, its sensory cluster, a collection of organs that served functions beyond mere sight or hearing, focused intently on Eliana. The patterns along its exoskeleton flashed in a sequence that xenobiologists had tentatively labeled as intense interest, but that most species instinctively interpreted as calculating the most efficient way to disassemble you. "A human." Kavak's voice was surprisingly melodious, though the translation matrix added unsettling harmonics that made several representatives clutch their comfort objects. "How delicious." High Counselor Zylberth's respiratory sacs deflated completely in alarm. "Ambassador Kavex, we were not expecting your attendance today." Clearly, the Vraxian's limbs rippled in what might have been amusement. "Yet here I am. The Dominion has interest in the human question." Eliana, displaying either remarkable courage or a concerning lack of self-preservation instinct, inclined her head respectfully toward the Vraxian. "Ambassador Kavex, I've studied your species' contributions to interstellar navigation. Your stellar cartography is unparalleled. The chamber went silent again, but this time with a different quality. The stunned silence of beings witnessing someone complement a hurricane on its rotational symmetry. Pex's sensory cluster realigned, focusing more intensely on Eliana. You study Vraxian accomplishments, human. I make it a point to learn from the achievements of all spacefaring civilizations, Eliana replied. Knowledge has no borders. Before Kevex could respond to this unexpected approach, alarms began blaring throughout the chamber. Red lights pulsed along the walls, and a computerized voice announced, "Security breach detected, lockdown protocols initiated." The representatives erupted into chaos. Some species were naturally inclined toward panic. The Malorians began secreting defensive mucus that made the floor hazardous, while the PSIPT delegation simply vanished in puffs of emergency teleportation, leaving behind the distinctive odor of burnt cinnamon. "Order!" Zylbert attempted to shout over the cacophony, his respiratory sacs inflating to dangerous proportions. The embassy's security systems are the most sophisticated in the quadrant. There is no cause for... The lights went out. When the emergency systems finally kicked in 30 seconds later, bathing the chamber in an eerie blue glow, two things became immediately apparent. The massive security doors had sealed everyone inside, and Ambassador Frost was now alone with Kevax, in the central speaking pit, separated from the rest of the representatives by an emergency force field. "Well," Eliana said, looking up at the Vraxian that loomed over her, "this is awkward." In the security control center 12 levels above, Chief Security Officer Drex was having the worst day of his 27-year career. "What do you mean?" "The system initiated quarantine protocols," he demanded, his four eyes blinking asynchronously in stress. "On what grounds?" The junior technician, a quintillion with an unfortunate tendency to molt under pressure, gestured helplessly at the displays. "The biohazard sensors detected an unknown pathogen, sir. According to the logs, it originated in the central chamber approximately 2 minutes after the Vraxian delegate entered, and the system's response was to lock the human alone with the Varaxian." Drex slammed a tentacle against the console. "The same Varaxians who were at war with 17 different species before developing spaceflight? The Varaxians who considered diplomatic immunity to be, and I quote, a charming fiction for species too weak to defend themselves? The quarantine protocols prioritize containment based on threat assessment algorithms," the technician explained, shedding iridescent scales at an alarming rate. The system identified the lowest risk scenario as isolating the two highest classified predatory species together, away from the general representatives. The lowest risk. Drex couldn't even finish the sentence. "Override it, now." "That's the problem, sir. The override requires authorization from both the security chief, that's you, and the current presiding council member, who is currently locked in the chamber," Drex concluded, all four eyes closing briefly in resignation. "Along with every other being with override clearance," the technician nodded miserably. "The good news is that we have full surveillance capability. We can see and hear everything happening in the central pit." "Wonderful," Drex muttered, turning to the main view screen. "So we'll have perfect documentation of the diplomatic incident that ends my career and possibly triggers an interspecies war." The screen showed the human and the Vraxian standing approximately 3 meters apart within the force field bubble. Neither appeared to be actively attempting to kill the other, which Drex counted as a minor miracle. "Activate audio," he ordered. "Completely unnecessary," the human was saying, her tone remarkably composed for someone sharing enclosed space with a creature that had evolved to hunt beings twice her size. "I'm sure the security system will recognize the error shortly, perhaps." The Vraxian's bioluminescent patterns shifted in a slow, deliberate sequence. "Or perhaps this is not an error but an opportunity, human. I prefer Ambassador Frost, if you don't mind. Names are earned among my kind," Kivix replied. "Not given at birth and carried without achievement." Instead of taking offense, the human smiled. "That's fascinating. On Earth, many indigenous cultures had similar practices. Warriors would earn new names after proving themselves in battle or passing important life trials." The Vraxian sensory cluster realigned in what xenobiologists had tentatively classified as surprise. "Your species practices name-earning?" "Some cultures did, historically. Others place great importance on family names that carry ancestral history. My own name, Frost, originated with ancestors who lived in cold northern regions. Cold adaptation, Kovacs noted, a valuable evolutionary trait. In the security center, Drex watched with mounting bewilderment. Are they making small talk about cultural anthropology? Sir, the technician interrupted, pointing to another display. The quarantine system has initiated environmental stress testing. What does that mean in non-technical terms? It means the system is going to progressively make conditions in the containment field more extreme to neutralize the perceived pathogen. Rex stared at the technician. Define extreme. First, rapid temperature fluctuations. Then atmospheric composition changes. Finally, if necessary, radiation pulses, while containing a human and a Vraxian together. Drex's skin turned a sickly shade of green. Get me direct communication with the chamber, now. Inside the force field bubble, Eliana noticed the temperature beginning to drop. Her diplomatic training included extensive preparation for environmental emergencies, a necessity when dealing with species that considered methane a refreshing beverage, or could accidentally release enough radiation during excitement to sterilize a small moon. It seems our situation is about to become more interesting, Ambassador Kovacs, she observed, noting the frost beginning to form on the polished floor. The quarantine system appears to be initiating cold exposure protocols. The Vraxians' bioluminescent patterns shifted to deeper blues. Vraxians evolved on a world with extreme temperature variations. Cold is inconvenient, not threatening. Humans are similarly adaptable, Eliana replied, though she subtly adjusted her suit's thermal regulation settings. Earth Diplomatic Corps hadn't skimped on the technology integrated into their non-threatening attire. Outside the force field, the representatives were in various states of distress. Many species from warmer worlds were already showing signs of cold stress, their bodies not designed for rapid temperature drops. The emergency systems were deploying thermal blankets, but xenobiological diversity made universal solutions impossible. A crackling sound filled the chamber as the communication system activated. Ambassador Frost, Ambassador Kovacs, came a strained voice. This is Chief Security Officer Drex. We're experiencing a malfunction in our quarantine protocols. The system has detected what it believes to be a pathogen and is initiating countermeasures. I suspected as much, Eliana replied calmly. What's the estimated time for override? There was a pause before Drex answered. The override requires authorization from officials currently contained within the chamber. We're exploring alternative solutions. Kovacs's sensory cluster rotated in what Eliana had begun to recognize as irritation. Your security systems are as inefficient as they are intrusive, Drex. We're doing everything possible, Ambassador Kovacs, Drex assured, his voice betraying his fear of the Vraxian. In the meantime, please be aware that conditions within the containment field will continue to deteriorate as the system attempts to neutralize the perceived threat. Wonderful, Eliana murmured as the communication cut off. The temperature had already dropped to levels that would induce hypothermia in an unprotected human. Her suit was compensating, but she could feel the chill seeping through at the extremities. Cax studied her with evident curiosity. You show remarkable composure, human. Panicking rarely improves survival odds, she replied with a slight shrug. Besides, I once spent 3 weeks in a research station during an Antarctic blizzard after our communications equipment failed. This is practically tropical by comparison. The Vraxian made a sound that the translation matrix rendered as a sardonic chuckle. Your species consistently defies categorization, Ambassador Frost. The Confederation fears you as dangerous predators, yet you lack the physical advantages of true apex species. Humans are adaptable generalists, Eliana explained, rubbing her hands together for warmth. We're not the strongest, fastest, or most physically imposing species, but we're remarkably good at surviving conditions that should, by all rights, kill us. A trait we share, Kovacs observed, though our methods differ significantly. The temperature continued to plummet, reaching levels that would instantly freeze exposed human flesh. Eliana's extremities had begun to lose sensation despite her suit's thermal protection. Outside the force field, several representatives had been evacuated for medical treatment, while others huddled in emergency thermal shelters. Ambassador Kovacs, Eliana said, her voice now slightly strained. I believe we may need to pool our resources if we're going to survive long enough for them to fix this system. The Vraxian's patterns shifted to a configuration she hadn't seen before. You propose cooperation? I do. Eliana gestured to the environment around them. The temperature will continue to drop, and my environmental protection has limitations. You mentioned cold is inconvenient for your species. I presume that means your biology has adaptations that mitigate extreme cold. Correct. Kvek seemed intrigued by her reasoning. Vraxians can generate significant metabolic heat when necessary. Then I suggest a mutually beneficial arrangement. Your species values pragmatism, as does mine. The Vraxian studied her for several long moments, its sensory cluster realigning multiple times. Finally it moved closer, its massive form towering over her. Your proposal has merit, Kvek acknowledged. Though it would be unprecedented. Diplomatic history is filled with unprecedented moments, Eliana replied, her breath now visibly crystallizing. That's rather the point of diplomacy, to the shock of every conscious representative watching from beyond the force field. The Varaxian extended multiple limbs to create a semi-enclosed space, and invited the human to step within its protective embrace. Even more shocking was that Ambassador Frost did so without hesitation. The Vraxian's exoskeleton began to emit a dull orange glow as its metabolic systems generated intense heat. Within the improvised shelter of its limbs, Eliana found herself in a pocket of survivable warmth. Your trust is either commendable or evidence of brain damage from cold exposure, Kvek observed. I prefer calculated risk assessment, Eliana replied. You have no evolutionary or cultural predisposition to harm me without cause, and we currently share a mutual interest in survival. Besides, killing a diplomatic representative tends to create more problems than it solves. An efficient analysis? The Vraxian's voice contained what might have been approval. Most species react to Vraxians with instinctive terror. Oh, don't mistake composure for absence of fear, Eliana clarified. My heart rate is currently elevated enough that my suit is considering administering sedatives. I'm just prioritizing survival over panic. This earned another of those sounds that might have been laughter. A practical approach. As they maintained their unlikely alliance against the cold, the quarantine system moved to its next phase. The temperature began to normalize, but the atmospheric composition started to change. Oxygen levels dropped, while carbon dioxide increased. A combination that would eventually asphyxiate most oxygen-breathing species. Atmospheric manipulation, Kvek noted. Sensors detecting the change before most equipment could measure it. Creative but ineffective. Vraxians can filter toxins and process minimal oxygen. Humans aren't quite so fortunate, Eliana admitted, already feeling the effects as her breathing became more labored. Though we can survive oxygen deprivation better than many species. She reached into her diplomatic satchel and retrieved what looked like a small metallic disc. Fortunately, Earth Diplomatic Corps plans for contingencies. She pressed the disc to her throat, and it adhered to her skin, extending nearly invisible filaments. Almost immediately her breathing eased. Nanoscale oxygen extractor and concentrator, she explained. It can pull oxygen molecules from even trace amounts in the atmosphere and deliver them directly to the bloodstream. Short-term solution, but better than nothing. Kvek's sensory cluster focused on the device. Your technology is more advanced than Confederation records indicate. We find it advantageous to be underestimated, Eliana replied with a slight smile. Another trait humans share with Vraxians, I believe. Outside the force field, the situation had deteriorated into near chaos. Many representatives had been evacuated, while others argued vehemently with security staff about the handling of the crisis. High Councillor Silbert's respiratory sacs were fully inflated in what appeared to be a mixture of distress and outrage, as he berated Chief Security Officer Drex through a communication link. Meanwhile, Eliana and Kvek continued their unlikely diplomatic exchange, sharing observations about their respective species' evolutionary adaptations and survival strategies. Despite the increasingly hostile environment within the force field, they maintained a conversation that would later be described by xenolinguists as the most productive first contact dialogue in Confederation history. The quarantine system, following its programmed protocols, finally initiated its most severe countermeasure. Radiation pulses designed to destroy any remaining pathogenic material. This could be problematic, Eliana acknowledged, as warning indicators flashed around the perimeter of the force field. Human radiation tolerance is moderate at best. Kvek's bioluminescent patterns shifted to a deep crimson. Vraxians absorb radiation as an emergency energy source, but the levels indicated would eventually cause system damage even to us. Eliana's diplomatic training had covered many scenarios, but trapped in a radiation chamber with an apex predator alien had been notably absent from the curriculum. Still, her background in extreme environments provided an alternative perspective. Ambassador Kovex, she said thoughtfully, I believe I may have a solution, but it would require your cooperation and a certain degree of trust. Elaborate. The Vraxian responded, its attention fully focused on her. Your species can absorb radiation and convert it to energy, she began. Human technology often uses similar principles for shielding. My suit contains emergency radiation barriers that can be deployed to create a small protected zone. If we combine your biological radiation absorption with my technological shielding, we might create a sustainable microenvironment. The Vraxian's sensory cluster realigned several times, analyzing her proposal. You would place your survival entirely in the appendages of a species classified as hostile by your own government. I prefer to make my own assessments of hostility, Eliana replied. So far, you've been significantly more helpful than the Confederation security systems. What happened next would later be described with varying degrees of accuracy and considerable sensationalism across galactic media networks. The official record stated simply that Ambassador Frost and Ambassador Kovex implemented an emergency biological technological interface to neutralize environmental hazards. The reality was both more mundane and more extraordinary. A human and a Vraxian, representatives of species that evolutionary logic suggested should be instinctive enemies, cooperated to create a symbiotic defense system against artificial environmental threats. Eliana reconfigured her suit's radiation barriers into an expandable field, while Kovex positioned its body to optimize radiation absorption, creating a shield around them both. The Vraxian's exoskeleton began to pulse with increasing brightness as it processed the incoming radiation, while Eliana's technology redirected and contained what it couldn't absorb. Outside the force field, the remaining representatives watched in astonishment. Most species required extensive treaties and years of diplomatic negotiation before sharing survival technologies. Yet here was a human, a species barely recognized by the Confederation, engaged in intimate cooperation with a Vraxian, the most isolationist and feared predatory species in known space. Impossible, High Counselor Zylbert whispered, his respiratory sacs deflating in shock. The probability calculations for peaceful Vraxian-human interaction predicted catastrophic conflict in 97.8% of scenarios. Ambassador Takrill's crystalline appendages vibrated in what might have been amusement. Perhaps your algorithms failed to account for pragmatism, Counselor. Both species evolved on worlds that punished ideological rigidity with extinction. After 43 minutes of radiation exposure, during which Eliana and Kovex maintained continuous dialogue ranging from comparative evolutionary biology to the philosophical implications of predatory adaptation in sentient species, the quarantine system finally deactivated. The force field disappeared with an anticlimactic soft chime, leaving the human and the Vraxian standing in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the stunned representatives of the Galactic Confederation. For several moments, no one spoke. The silence was broken by Chief Security Officer Drex rushing into the chamber, followed by a team of medical personnel. Ambassador Frost, Ambassador Kovex, he called out, his four eyes blinking rapidly. Are you injured? Our systems detected extreme environmental conditions within the containment field. Before either could respond, the quarantine system's analysis appeared on the main display screens around the chamber. Pathogen analysis complete. Detected agent, human Versailles diplomatic comparation. Threat assessment. Existential recommended action. Paradigm shift. The Confederation's AI had apparently developed a sense of humor, or possibly achieved sentience, and was commenting on the absurdity of biological politics. Either way, the message captured the historic nature of what had transpired. Eliana stepped forward, her suit slightly scorched but her composure intact. Representatives of the Galactic Confederation, while I cannot recommend your security protocols, I must commend the opportunity they provided for demonstrating the practical benefits of cooperation between unlike species. Kovex moved beside her, its imposing form somehow no longer appearing quite so threatening to the watching representatives. The human speaks truth. Survival transcends ideological boundaries. The Vraxian Dominion recognizes practical alliance where advantageous. High Counselor Zylbert's respiratory sacs inflated and deflated several times as he struggled to process this unprecedented turn of events. Ambassador Frost. Ambassador Cavex. On behalf of the Confederation, I extend our deepest apologies for this technical malfunction. I propose we reframe the incident, Ileana suggested. Not as a malfunction, but as an unscheduled demonstration of crisis management capabilities. An efficient perspective, Cavex agreed. Outcomes supersede intentions. The chamber erupted into a cacophony of voices as representatives debated the implications. Some species saw the human-Vraxian cooperation as promising, others as deeply concerning. A few of the more paranoid representatives suggested it might be evidence of a pre-existing secret alliance. Amid the chaos, Ileana caught Cavex's sensory cluster focused on her. The Vraxian's bioluminescent patterns formed a sequence she hadn't seen before. Your species has earned consideration, Ambassador Frost, Cavex said, its voice pitched to carry only to her. The Vraxian Dominion will support human inclusion in Confederation affairs. Given the Vraxian Dominion's notorious isolationism and general disdain for Confederation politics, this was equivalent to receiving an enthusiastic endorsement, complete with parade and fireworks. I appreciate your support, Ambassador Cavex, Ileana replied. Earth would welcome future dialogue with the Dominion. You have earned your name, the Vraxian stated, using a formal phrasing that the translation matrix flagged as culturally significant. In the tongue of my ancestors you would be called Kaleth Na, one who thrives in dying light. Before Ileana could respond to this unexpected honor, High Counselor Zylbert managed to restore order to the chamber. In light of today's unprecedented events, he announced, his tone suggesting he was still processing exactly what had transpired, the Council proposes immediate reconsideration of Earth's application for observer status. The vote that followed was not unanimous. Several species abstained, citing the need for further analysis. But with the Vraxian Dominion's support, the outcome was never really in doubt. Earth was granted observer status in the Galactic Confederation, with a pathway to full membership accelerated from the standard 50 years to just 15. More significant, though less officially acknowledged, was the subtle shift in how the Confederation viewed both humans and Vraxians. The incident prompted a re-evaluation of the algorithms used to predict diplomatic outcomes, particularly for species classified as evolutionary predators. As the chamber finally emptied, Ileana found herself standing alone with High Counselor Zylbert, whose respiratory sacs had finally returned to their normal dimensions. I must confess, Ambassador Frost, he said quietly, when the quarantine activated, I expected a very different outcome. You expected violence, Ileana observed. It seemed the only logical conclusion. Predatory species, threat conditions, competition for resources. He gestured vaguely with his appendages. The equations all pointed to conflict. Ileana smiled. With respect, High Counselor, I believe your equations overlooked a critical variable. And what variable would that be? That sometimes the most dangerous thing a predator can do, she replied, is decide to cooperate with another predator. As she walked away to prepare her report for Earth, leaving the High Counselor to contemplate this unsettling observation, Ileana reflected on the irony of the situation. The Confederation had feared humans as dangerous because of their predatory evolution, never considering that the same evolutionary pressures that made them dangerous had also made them exceptionally good at making allies in hostile environments. The universe, as it turned out, had a rather twisted sense of humor indeed. 3 standard months later, the Galactic Confederation convened an emergency session to address a border dispute between the Quilidian Union and the Emprith Collective that threatened to escalate into open conflict. As representatives arrived, many noted with surprise the presence of both the human delegation and Ambassador Cavex of the Vraxian Dominion. I wasn't aware either Earth or the Dominion had interests in the disputed sector, Ambassador Takrill commented as the session prepared to begin. They don't, High Counselor Zylbert replied, his respiratory sacs pulsing with what might have been resignation. They've been invited to advise on crisis resolution strategies, predators, mediating peace. Krill's crystalline appendages shimmered with amusement. The universe does enjoy its ironies. Across the chamber, Ambassador Frost and Ambassador Cavex conferred quietly, 2 apex species planning cooperation instead of competition. The Confederation representatives watched nervously, still uncertain whether this new alliance represented the greatest hope for galactic stability or simply a more efficient form of predation. Only time would tell, but one thing was already clear: the universe would never be quite the same again.